Gen AI lawsuits. It's about where does fair use apply? What about copyright? What is the law trying to achieve here? There's an answer to that, to promote the progress of science and the useful arts. On the one hand, we have science and useful artistic outputs coming out of generative AI. We also have a trade-off. It does seem like we're eroding some of the rights that people have traditionally associated with their works. We need clarity on what's going on, and we need to give creators a way to signal their preferences and to enforce those preferences.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Stack Overflow podcast, a place to talk all things software and technology. I'm your host, Ben Popper, Director of Content here at Stack Overflow. When Stack Overflow was started in 2008, it was really an attempt to create a place where software developers, engineers, technologists could share knowledge without a paywall. At the time, there was something called Experts Exchange, where you might find answers to your coding questions, but you'd have to pay up first, or you might find answers to your coding questions, but they were inside of a long, rambling blog, and hard to say if the answer was correct. So Stack Overflow's idea was harness the wisdom of the crowds, make this forum, give people free internet points. Who doesn't love it? Reputation, gamify it a little, and then create these knowledge artifacts. So over time, that's built up to, I believe it's now over 20 million, probably far more than that, question and answer couplets, with accepted answers. And more added each day. One of the biggest changes in the world of technology over the last year and a half has been the explosive growth in focus around generative AI and large language models. And large language models can be quite good at generating code, and some of them are trained on Stack Overflow data. So we, for example, announced partnerships with OpenAI and with Google for Gemini, where they will train their models on our data. And in return, we receive resources that we can then funnel back into the company and the community. And the idea is that hopefully there becomes a virtuous cycle between the humans who create the knowledge and the AI that is trained on it. Today, I have two great guests, Shane Longpre, an MIT PhD student, and Robert Mehari, who is both an MIT PhD and a Harvard JD. They are here to discuss a paper that came out, Consent in Crisis, the Rapid Decline of the AI Data Commons, which looks at the decline in availability of some of the biggest data sets that were once public and served as the training for these foundation and frontier LLM models or Gen AI models. The two of them work with an organization called the Data Province Initiative that's auditing and looking at and thinking about the future of public data on the internet and how that will work with respect to AI systems and their training corpuses. So without further ado, Shane, Robert, welcome to the Stack Overflow podcast.
Great to be here, Ben. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Ben.
Maybe tell folks how it is that you got involved with this particular project and what was sort of the genesis of this paper.
Yeah, sure. So we've been working for a while on tracing the provenance, the sources, the licenses of data sets that are used in training AI models, and also the representation and diversity and heterogeneity of that data as well. Because it turns out these data sets really are what's driving the capabilities that are really impressive in modern AI models. Surprisingly, people don't have a good grasp, including the engineers, of the composition of that data, where it came from, what are the potential issues with it, whether it's legal, ethical, or just the appropriate composition for what you want to do. And so we wanted to shed more transparency into that and also bring light into what the trends are, because many people weren't realizing sort of the legal, ethical issues, but actually there's been an issue for a while. And so some of our studies shed light on this.
How did you decide on the sources you believed were substantial? As we're saying, we don't exactly know what's inside. How do you determine that? I think it said something like there's 1,800, sort of major data sources, and you cited a few really big ones that are public. How do you know what to look at to say this we think is the corpus that it's drawing on? Let's start there, and then the follow-up question. Knowing what the sources are and knowing now, how some folks are changing, you're talking about, potentially a decline in the AI commons. What would be the impact of that? The training data of the models is often not released, right? When they're shared. So let's start with, how did you decide what you believe is the AI commons?
The data commons, as we define it, is largely publicly accessible, crawlable data. It's the web. And we use Common Crawl, a nonprofit, as the basis for this, because literally millions of AI models have been trained off of this resource, and not just text models, but that crawl and the links have also been used to train multimodal models. So images, videos, speech, audio, all these things. And that is the foundation for modern foundation models. And so we look at the composition of that crawl, which is likely to be not too dissimilar from what big companies will also have access to. And we sampled the largest web domains contributing the most tokens or words in the data set from those, about 2,000 from 3 major data sets, then 10,000 as a random sample to tell us what the web is and permissions and preference signals are in the web writ large. And so we actually looked underneath popular pre-training data sets to the websites from which they're taken and did the audit on those.
I think I understand now. You're saying we decided that we, could get a good bead on what data set they're using by first looking at the common crawl, which is enormous, and encompasses a large portion of the internet. And then let's take out the constituent parts of that, that are extremely large. And then let's also take a random sampling. And if we get the chance, look at fine-tuning data. Would you compare this in some ways to the early days of search when a lot of questions arose around should big search engines be licensing this or paying some kind of transactional fee every time, they surface an excerpt of the content? And as search engines became more and more proactive about surfacing large bits of content, the question became, are they driving traffic in the same way they used to, or are they simply answering the user's query right on their search page? And in that sense, getting more and more value from the content that they index without providing this concomitant value to organizations that are out creating the news and the content.
A lot of the legal cases that are being cited in the Gen AI lawsuits are actually from that kind of era of search. In many ways, the kind of legal questions are similar, right? It's about, to what degree can you use this content in order to create a product that is quite different from the original purpose of the content. If we're looking at some of the tool usage and the web search capabilities of Gen AI, you could imagine driving traffic to the original artifacts. But of course, that's not the only way that people are using the content. And sometimes it is a kind of direct replacement, right? And you have situations where someone won't access the original content because they can get the answer or the information through a generative tool. Without getting too much into the legal weeds of this, there are two types of discussions that are happening. The first is about whether training an AI model before you've generated any outputs, whether that causes any sorts of legal issues. We've been drawing a bit of a distinction between fine-tuning data and pre-training data. There are other distinctions worth drawing, but the interesting distinction is that by and large, pre-training data was created for some purpose other than training AI models, whereas fine-tuning data is generally created for the sole purpose of training AI models. And so it seems like some of the factors that people would consider in the fair use analysis would weigh more in favor of a finding of fair use for pre-training data than for fine-tuning data. But there are going to be exceptions, especially when you start looking at one of the factors of the fair use test in the US, which relates to the market impact. And so, of course, there are going to be some pre-training providers, I guess, where the market impact will be more intensive for them than for others. So these are some of the considerations on the first side. And then you have the output side, right? So when a specific output is generated, does that specific output, if it's similar to something that was in the training data, cause a copyright issue? And there, it seems like you have kind of a whole separate analysis, which is about how are you using that output? So if I'm an artist and my art makes its way into the training data, and you then generate an artifact that is really similar to a specific work of art that I've created, if you're only using that to show your friends, or maybe you print it out and hang it on your wall, but you don't show anybody else, that is a different situation than if a company is using it in their marketing material.
Robert, just sort of briefly, can you give the folks who are listening a quick overview of fair use doctrine and how that's applied in the past to data on the internet, and how it relates to these new questions that are arising around large language models?
So the first thing to say is that fair use is an American concept. And one of the big challenges that we'll have in the AI space is how do we gain global consensus on some of these legal questions. The fact is that a lot, but not all of the major generative AI foundation model companies are located in the US. So it makes sense kind of pragmatically to start here, but there are other regulations elsewhere. And so fair use is a doctrine that essentially allows you to use a protected work in some way that is very different from the original work's purpose, that doesn't really compete with the original work. A good example is satire, right? So if you have a play and I write a satirical article about that play, even if I use, quotations from the original play, or maybe even images from the original play, if I use those in a way that is completely different in the purpose I'm trying to achieve, that doesn't really compete with the market for the original, etc., then that's more likely to be deemed fair use. Another example is education, if I'm using, copyrighted material for education. And so the big question is whether using content that was created for, dissemination on the internet to train AI models, whether that amounts to fair use. And there has been a lot of spilled ink on that question, both academically and in various lawsuits.
Yeah, I want to just add a little context from the Stack Overflow side, and then Shane, maybe we can hear from you. When I think about fair use, I often think of like this test, like you said, is it transformative in some way and is it competitive in some way? If it's both transformative and non-competitive, it will probably pass the fair use test. And you made a good example there with art, right? Like if I make a piece of art for myself that I want to use this with my screensaver, probably not a big deal. If I, ask an AI to generate images in the style of X artist specifically, and then I make posters and sell them online, that's a different question. Now there's like a commercial aspect to it that probably touches more on the artist's copyright. And then again, let's take this back to some of the questions internally. What we're asking is if I am at Stack Overflow and a system has been trained on our data, and then it goes out and generates code for folks, we specifically cited it in our sharing of the data over the years that it should be used for educational purposes, academic research purposes, personal purposes, but not commercial. So if you're charging for code gen and you've trained on our data, then maybe there is an issue, especially if, the solutions that you're providing are essentially identical to the ones you would find on Stack Overflow. And so what we've been saying, and this came up before, and some of what you said was that, we want to work out licensing deals. We want to return value to the community. And then lastly, we want attribution if possible. You provide code, but then you provide citations to the questions on Stack Overflow that allowed this answer to be created. And you provide links that, folks can go and check the ground truth, which is actually important, right? Like we know LLMs, Gen AI tend to hallucinate. So you get an answer, but you can actually also check it against, the accepted answer on Stack Overflow, which has been vetted by thousands of human beings. But Shane, tell me how you're thinking about this particular question.
In our paper, probably one of the most controversial plots is the last one that I will quickly disclaim and say there are several limitations. First off, it's from a dataset called WildChat that is volunteered contributed logs by real users who are using AI models, and they contributed their logs. And this is one of the few naturalistic data sources that we have to tell us how are people potentially using these models. The disclaimer is that knowing that they're volunteering their logs, knowing that it's contributed in sort of an academic context, and given that's one model in one place of time, it doesn't represent all of generative AI, and we don't know how representative it really is. But this one LLM use, in this case ChatGPT, we actually manually went through hundreds, thousands of the logs and tried to representatively measure what the different uses were. And interestingly, Ben, can you guess? I don't know if you read it, but do you know what the number one use was?
You're smiling, and I'm from Stack Overflow, so I'll say answering coding questions, but I don't know. Code generation?
So coding was one of the top few. It was actually about 8 to 10% of all queries were for code, which surprises me because it's probably about 50 to 70% of what I do.
The other big one would be like college essays and homework questions. I don't know.
That was a big one as well. The biggest actually was creative composition by a large margin, actually. So people writing fiction, poetry, role-playing different things. And the second one, at least in this context, maybe somewhat surprisingly, and there's a different tangent, is sexual role play. But in any case, we can kind of actually see to some extent how people might be using these models. And it's interesting that something like current affairs and news was very low, but that might be because ChatGPT has the time cutoff, whereas something like coding was pretty significant as our creative uses. And so in the case of Stack Overflow, you're absolutely right. It likely is that these models are being used for cases that are directly using Stack Overflow knowledge or data, or at least other sources, GitHub, that might have been pulled from. I can add more details if you want to sort of attribution question, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just stop you there for a second and then let you speak on attribution. But right, this is one of the areas where you might see, this is my opinion based on nothing but my gut and not legal expertise. But, if it was people generating poetry or fiction or role-playing scenarios for a Dungeons and Dragons campaign, and what they were saying was, I need, you to help me fill in something based on these adjectives and evocative descriptions I give. But I'm not saying, write me 3 pages like a Robert Pattinson novel, and then I'm going to go, and do the rest. And then together we're going to basically write a Robert Pattinson novel, in which case, like, the artist might fairly claim like, it's read my works and now it's recreating them for you. And so, like, this is an issue. Now, you could say, like, how is that really different from saying, write me a spy thriller that, feels like a bestseller. Together, we're going to create this book. But of course, what do people do? They read bestsellers and then they try to imitate and take from there, what they think is best. Is the fact that the models can do it at scale and the fact that they can produce it at scale and velocity change things? Like, if an artist has to go out and read, 100 detective novels and then think about how to synthesize that style and then sit down and do it themselves, that's one thing. If a AI system can read the entire internet and then produce, thousands of novels a day, as long as you have, the money to pay for the inference, is that different? But let me let you speak to the question of attribution.
Yeah, there's so many different tangents that are interesting here, Ben. On attribution, when it comes to many of these tasks, it's lacking just because something called influence functions or other methods that we try to develop in order to trace what examples in the training set influenced a generation are underdeveloped, and it's not clear. People have been working on this for a long time that will have any sort of clear certainty into, what distribution of examples influenced a certain generation and why, and how to measure that in a clear way. So the real proposed panacea, which it isn't, but the one that people really love is RAG, retrieval augmented generation. Because if you retrieve at test time, when people are really using the model, different web pages, that could be Stack Overflow, it could be different news items, it could be, actual fiction or something itself, that gives people the opportunity to point directly to and cite back to these sources, even flow traffic to them. And we're even seeing modern AI developers introducing new crawlers on the web, which is where they collect their data. Some are for training data, but then the newer ones are for search and retrieval. And so they're sort of separating out these two uses because they're hoping that maybe some artist doesn't want to be in the training data, but maybe they want to be referenced at retrieval time because they think that would drive more traffic to them, or they could be cited or attributed. And it remains to be seen how this will sort of develop.
Yeah, we wrote a blog post about building that kind of system internally. And we have Stack Overflow for Teams internally, which is like our knowledge base. That's like a SaaS product we sell. And there, that's exactly what it does. It performs a RAGs type of search, and then it can provide citations. And when I go and ask a cutting edge, LLM, hey, can you like give me an update on the situation over here, with these geopolitical actors? Often it'll say searching the web, analyzing, verifying sources, and then it will include citations. Or I like to ask it about, academic research. Like, can you tell me, what the most cited papers in brain-machine interface were for the last month, and, include a couple links to the papers, and then it does it. It's using the reasoning capabilities and the natural language capabilities to understand and reply that it gained through its training, but it's basically performing a web search and responding with what it finds there in order to provide you with the answer. And so that allows you to understand, right, exactly what data it used to create the response at inference time. Whereas you pointed out, otherwise it's sort of a black box. We don't know of everything it trained on, what caused it to generate that response. Models are not deterministic. 5 people could ask it the same question and get 5 slightly or even very, different answers in return, right? Robert, you want to weigh in on this?
Well, so I wanted to take kind of a big step back, right? And ask, like, what is the law trying to achieve here? And there's an answer to that, which is to, and this is a quote, to promote the progress of science and the useful arts. We have, on the one hand, science and I think useful artistic outputs coming out of generative AI. We also have, completely unrelated to generative AI, people creating, creative works, doing science, all sorts of interesting things. And so the question is, like, how do you trade? It seems like a trade-off, right? Like, it does seem like we're kind of eroding some of the rights that people have maybe traditionally associated with their works to allow someone else to, create these products. There is this like high level North Star that, at least in theory, is what we're trying to pursue. And
is that jurisprudence and precedent in the United States? You're saying we have this North Star of trying to promote the arts and sciences while also respecting, copyright and licensing. Is that?
Yeah, so the North Star comes from the kind of constitutional basis for intellectual property rights, which is this promotion of science and the useful arts. That's why we have IP law in the first place. That's why we're willing to give artists and creators and inventors, in the case of patents, this limited monopoly.
Right. We have IP laws so that people feel that they have suitable protections to pursue the arts and sciences and not be ripped off. And we also try to have fair use doctrine so that it's not so limiting as to, outlaw satire or education. So that's the balance we're striking.
We want people to disseminate their inventions, right? We don't want everything to be a secret. So you publish your patent, everybody knows what the invention is, but you get this monopoly for a limited time so that you can essentially recoup the investment you made. And copyright, it doesn't expire for a long time. But it does expire after a while, right? And then things become public domain and you can use them any way you want.
Do y'all have a thought on the potential for synthetic data? Is that in some way only circular reasoning, in the sense that creating synthetic data based on, studying actual data and then training on the synthetic data, not the actual data, isn't really avoiding, the original sin? It's only, creating some distance between your training run and data that may be licensed or copyrighted in a certain way.
When you imply the circular element of synthetic data, I think you're absolutely right. There is that concern. But the place where synthetic data is really shining, or likely to shine, or where AI researchers are most excited about it, is actually with code. Because unlike where you simply evolve or paraphrase existing text like you might in traditional synthetic or data augmentation, in the coding environment, you can ask the model to write simple tests to check if the intended coding task succeeded. And so maybe a model attempts 1,000 times to solve a complex coding problem. And the first iteration, only 5 of those 1,000 times it got right. But you can check because you can see that they passed the tests. And so then you have negative examples and positive examples. And through contrastive learning and reinforcement learning iteration, maybe the next time it gets 50 right, maybe 100. And you can ask it to develop more complex coding problems, write its own unit tests. And you have this circular development, self-play, that actually can improve the model from an outside signal, which is deploying the code and seeing whether it worked or not. So in some cases, I think synthetic data holds a lot of promise, but more in mathematical, analytical, and coding regimes where you have outside signals that can verify whether it did something or not. When it comes to creative writing or other more abstract concepts, I think that we might be in more of a circular loop.
And then there's the legal dimension to all of this, right? It seems like you could imagine trying to use synthetic data to put more distance between the pre-training data and the output model, right? Where you say, well, we used the pre-training data to train model 1. That generated a bunch of other data. We trained model 2 only on that other data. We didn't touch the pre-training data. Maybe we do that a couple of times, rinse and repeat. And so, Your Honor, the final product that we create here has nothing to do with the pre-training data. There's so many steps in between. I haven't seen this argument brought in court yet. I think we're not quite there yet. There's two perspectives. There's like the fruit of the poison tree. To put it like bluntly, you took the data without permission to begin with. I don't care what you did with the data in between. You washed it, you did whatever, but like the output model is based on that data. Or you have more nuanced arguments where it's like, well, what is copyright really protecting? And it's not protecting general styles. It's not protecting knowledge or facts or anything like that. It's protecting a specific work. And if you put enough distance between the original specific works and the final model, then maybe you're not learning to essentially memorize a specific work or a set of specific works. You're learning these generalizable facts. And I expect we're going to see this play out in court. It'll be very interesting to see how the kind of use of synthetic data is used from a litigation and a legal perspective. But I expect there'll be some action there.
Some folks are closing off their data, saying we don't want AI models to train on this. Similar to the way in the past, some people might have said we don't want this data indexed for search. What may happen to the data commons or the AI data commons, and what would the results of that be?
So in less than a 10-month period, a significant portion of the data in really popular pre-training data sets was closed off. And in particular, about a quarter of the most popular, most well-maintained, highest quality data was retracted, at least if you respect these preference signals, which are shown in their robots.txt. It's the one readable file on the internet for both machines and humans that essentially indicates whether or not we want our data to be used and by whom. If you look at the terms of service that web pages are putting up, the restrictions are much higher. But the sort of unspoken tragedy is that while the terms of service is communicated in natural language that allows you to express exactly what you want or don't want to be done with your data, it's not machine readable. So machines rely on robots.txt and they ignore the terms of service. A significant amount of data is rapidly going away if you respect these signals, which many are and others might not be, but might have to in the future. And we expect that to continue rapidly. And when it comes to AI language models, the scale of data, and especially of the high quality data, really matters. And so this will affect the performance, maybe the factuality, maybe the composition and representativity of the underlying data that's powering these models.
The other thing to mention here is, you have the robots.txt where websites express preferences, but you also have other ways by which websites can make their content harder to access. And it seems like in a world where there is a lot of regulatory ambiguity and a mixed adherence to robots.txt and the terms of service, a lot of websites are essentially resorting to self-help, right? Making it harder to access this content. We've spoken to a lot of folks who are in the web crawling business, and it seems like it is becoming much harder to get access to this data, putting the robots.txt aside. And this is somewhere where like my personal thinking has really evolved, because when we started this work like a year ago, I was of the opinion that at a societal level, it doesn't really make sense to have a licensing regime for pre-training data, because how would you even administer this? You would impose such costs on smaller companies that are trying to innovate, on researchers, that only the large companies that can afford to pay royalties and licensing fees would be able to compete, and this would be a worse outcome for the world. But what we're seeing is that in absence of licensing revenue and an ability to essentially direct what kind of content is used and how, websites are making access to their data harder, which means that we're back to square one, right? There are some companies that can afford to license this content, but for smaller players, for innovative players, for researchers, access is becoming harder. And you have this negative externality for everybody, like forget about AI, but everyone who wants to use the web is encountering more restrictions, more paywalls, more kind of impediments to accessing the web openly. And so, like I said, my thinking has evolved where I think it seems like without licenses, we're actually in a very similar world as with licenses. And what is really needed here, and I think this to me is the thrust of the paper, is we need clarity on what's going on, and we need to give creators a way to signal their preferences and to enforce those preferences, because otherwise they'll do self-help and it'll be decentralized and fragmented in a way that's worse for everybody.
I wonder if the world of software development may provide a path here, which is to say open source licensing can be quite specific, and you could imagine maybe a similar regime being built for fiction or even for imagery, where folks say there is limitations that I'm setting on how you can fork this, or how you can train on it, or what kind of output you can provide. If the query requests something of mine by name, but you have to respect the licensure I've set out, kind of like the Apache license would for certain kinds of open source code that can be reused by companies for commercial purposes, as long as they follow the strictures. But y'all are researchers. So what are the second order effects happening to academics and folks who want to look at this data, which is now being walled off?
I think it's really important to highlight that the current regime is devolving into a crawler's arms race, which means that the crawlers are becoming more sophisticated and working hard to get as much data as they can. And the websites are fighting back, not just with robots.txt preference signaling, but also by imposing technical barriers as well to try to differentiate and block bots from humans. And because there's one pipeline that all the bots go through, whether they're for researchers or for non-AI related uses, maybe it's like product catalogs or price comparison websites or, financial market research, web archives, or academic research, they all go through the same pipeline that really is not robust to modern, complex diversity of uses. And we really see that in our paper. I won't go into too much detail, but especially the smaller players, the creators and website domains, are having a really tough time tracking hundreds of different AI crawlers, figuring out which ones to block, what they're being used for, whether they're anti-competitive for them or would actually direct traffic to them. And as a result, they are trying to block just about everything or being much more aggressive for fear of what it might do to their platform. And so how does this play out? It plays out in a way that the large companies and creators, something like Stack Overflow even, they can get licensing deals, or they can invest in strong, robust blockers against other crawlers, or have a team of technicians that can figure out which crawlers to accept, which ones to block. But this doesn't work out for small creators who don't have any of those resources and don't have ability to license that data or block it. Think small artists, small publishers, things like that. And it doesn't work out for researchers because, tens of thousands of academic articles have been written on the web using these web archives. But right now, their ability to access data is the first one that's going to go because they don't have the ability to license or to access it easily. And we've talked to many who are struggling with that.
All right, everybody, it is that time of the show. We want to shout out someone who came on Stack Overflow and provided an answer or shared a little bit of their curiosity. Awarded 2 days ago to George Hawkins, the Populist Badge. That's when you provide an answer to a question that has an accepted answer, but your answer is so good that it outscores the accepted answer by at least 2x. So George, thanks for your answer to the question, how to get the base URL in Angular 5, and congrats on your Populist badge. I am Ben Popper. You can find me on X at Ben Popper. If you have questions or suggestions for the show, you want to come on and be a guest, or you want to hear us talk about something, email us, podcast@Stack Overflow. And if you like the show today, the nicest thing you could do for me, hit that subscribe button or leave us a rating and a review.
My name is Robert Mahari. It's great to be here. I do research on computational law at the MIT Media Lab and at Harvard Law School. If you want to know more about my work, you can check out my website at robertmahari.com or on LinkedIn. And if you want to know more about this work, check out our papers, Consent in Crisis, or the whole Data Provenance website.
Thanks for having me, Ben. It's been a pleasure to be on the podcast. I'm Shane Longpre. I'm a researcher at MIT. And you can find my work at shanelongpre.com or our work on the Data Provenance Initiative at dataprovenance.org. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you'd like to chat more.